episode 27 of Radio Omnicore. I'm your host, Colleen McClintock, and you're listening to the show that is guaranteed to teach you something useful and introduce you to a dynamic and interesting guest. In studio today, we welcome back Dr. Hilton Ratnick and our very special guest and long-standing friend of Omnicore, Dr. Conway. Lee is a clinical psychologist who consults to business, primarily at a senior and executive management level. She's an accomplished coach and experienced assessor. She specialises in diagnostic team interventions, individual and group coaching and facilitation, experiential workshops, skills audits, and conflict resolution. Lee offers a bespoke array of leadership development services to the corporate and public sector, primarily in South Africa, but has worked across various African countries. Lee has a deep knowledge and expertise with respect to the challenges facing leaders in the developing countries and had worked with many companies in Africa. Great. So, Lee, I'm so excited to have pinned you down. It took a while to get you into the studio to do this podcast. And I was mentioning earlier to you that I've already had so many comments about the content that you're going to share with us, because we're talking today about giving and receiving feedback. And given that you're an accomplished coach yourself, it's one of the primary reasons, in our experience also, that leaders come in for coaching. And more recently, you've helped us at Omnicore. I mean, you've been a long friend of Omnicore for many years, but you've come in to help us start our career discussions. So I think it was in those moments of just, watching you teach our staff that I thought this would be very valuable content to share. So I'm so grateful you're here. We've got Dr. Hilton Ratnick there in the corner. Apparently many doctors in the room today.
Too many doctors, thanks.
Just William and I hanging back.
So I'm excited to talk to Lee. We really enjoyed the workshops, and I think there's great life lessons for everybody in them. So it'll be good to unpack them a bit more.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
So I guess the first question I have is, why do we struggle with feedback so much? Why is it so hard to give it and to receive it?
I think it's hard to give feedback because we all have an underlying need to be liked. Mm-hmm. So when you're giving feedback, you're always worried about, is the person going to like me if I tell them the honest truth? So I think that makes it really hard. And then I think to receive feedback, it's an incredibly vulnerable experience, and you feel very exposed in the moment. And so I guess it triggers our defense mechanisms. Mm-hmm. And so it's hard to stay in that feeling and actually let the feedback land without some sort of emotional or instinctive response to it.
So it's pretty normal then to feel defensive, would you say?
Yes, I think it's 100% normal. Yeah, whichever way that defense mechanism arises, because it doesn't always look like defensiveness. It can also look like extreme sensitivity and receptiveness to the feedback.
And maybe just to unpack what it means, what does defense mechanism mean? How does that look if you're giving the feedback? How can you understand that someone is showing their defense mechanisms?
Well, I think that's what makes it hard, is because you can't always tell. Sometimes it's very obvious because you get that reaction and you can see that you're struggling to land your message, and then there's a defensiveness at work, but sometimes you actually can't tell. So, but I think the question is, what are our defense mechanisms? So to me, our defense mechanisms are really our normal protective instincts that we develop, usually in childhood, against the numerous painful comments that we hear, and they might not even be intended, and they might even be in the form of a kind of a joke or a comparison or just a little bit of in-family teasing, but it's all those labels that we don't really want to hear that are busy shaping us, and then we develop mechanisms to protect ourselves against the hurt of those comments.
It's quite difficult when you're giving feedback and you pick that stuff up. Now, both you and Hilton, I think, could easily be classified as masters at giving feedback. So, Hilton, do you want to share a bit about your tricks in giving feedback? How do you get it right?
So first of all, I don't consider myself a master at anything. I feel like a beginner at almost everything. Certainly had a lot of experience giving 360 feedbacks and assessment feedbacks. And my sense is that there's a way to prep the session that makes people a little bit more porous to receiving maybe difficult information. So, I mean, I would typically spend like a few minutes at the start of every session just talking about the way to be in the session, the openness, that it's useful to open your heart to what you're going to hear, that it's a gift, that there's great opportunity. I also often say, you know, the one way to have the session is you and I could argue about everything in here, and it's not going to be that productive. I'm going to encourage you to hear the stuff that might be hard to hear. We can have a discussion about it. You're allowed to challenge it. And so normally a bit of a soft conversation to kind of prep the person around the value of feedback and the best way to be in the room can alleviate some of the defensiveness. But I agree with Lee. I mean, people's natural instinct is to try explain things away when they're told some difficult news about themselves.
So I understand why it's hard to hear negative feedback, but why do some people struggle to hear positive feedback? So working with perhaps your employees and you're giving them a lot of positive feedback, but they hang on to the one or two things that you said in, you know, the conversation, and it's almost like they obliterate from their memory all the 10 positive things. And then they become kind of, well, my experience is this neediness of always just, can you tell me more, that I'm enough and that I'm good enough? So what is that about?
I think that's quite a challenging question. I don't think it's true of everyone that they can't hear positive feedback. So I'm not sure if you remember in the workshop we did, we talked about how some people are extremely feedback resistant, and then at the opposite end of the spectrum, you get people who are too feedback sensitive, and they do respond differently to both negative and positive feedback. So on the side where people are very feedback resistant, they have enormous difficulty with negative feedback. It instantly triggers their defenses, but they love to hear the positive feedback because often that's what makes them feel good about themselves. That's what plays into their I am okay, I'm good enough self-image, if you like. But on the other side, you have people who have some inner doubts about how good they really are. So those people struggle to hear positive feedback because they don't fundamentally believe it in their heart of hearts. So when you're telling it to them, they don't really believe it. They want to believe it, but they're struggling to actually internalize it.
So they don't trust the feedback.
They don't trust the feedback, yeah.
Now, how as a leader do you work around that?
Well, so ironically, with those same people, though, they believe the negative feedback.
Exactly.
So it's almost as if that then plays into, okay, well, I am not good enough, and now this person is confirming it, but anything they say positive, well, I don't really believe that, so that can't land with me.
Yeah, I find that exceptionally difficult in coaching, and I see the frustration from managers when, you know, they say, but I've told you so many times how I value this and I value that, and it's quite bad for the brand of the individual, because eventually the manager just gives up, you know, like, I don't know what else I have to do to tell you that you're good and I'm not going to fire you and you're okay.
I think it's because it plays into our underlying fear-based drivers, one of which is, am I good enough? Right. Am I liked enough? So whenever you touch on things that go to the heart of those fear-based drivers, we all have those fears inside of us, but we just deal with them differently. Some become extremely defensive. They can't hear anything negative. Others can only hear the negative. So it's not a kind of one type of response. And I think that's what also makes it hard, because you don't always know what's happening, you know, with a particular person that you're giving feedback to. You almost have to gauge that response. And you don't, and some people are quite good at also hiding how they're receiving it. So it looks on the surface that they're hearing this and it's landing, but actually underneath, they're actually very hurt.
So what could an individual do who really doesn't trust positive feedback? What sort of help do they need? I mean, I understand it's outside of coaching probably, but to develop their self-esteem and learn to trust some of the good stuff.
Well, I think it's less about needing validation from others and developing it within yourself. But that's easier said than done.
It's very hard to work with like low self-esteem and ramp it up and get it going. I mean, I think often the source of feedback is a variable in the occasion. So, you know, if you're an expert and you're giving someone feedback on an instrument or something, I mean, I think that there's an acceptance that you know a lot about this area. And sometimes it's much harder to give feedback to, say, like a spouse or a child as a parent, because like, who are you to tell me how to live my life, or what makes you an authority on a better way to do things? So I think often the power dynamics inside of a feedback session become a variable themselves. I mean, I think in a leadership, you know, where you're a manager and you're leading someone, I mean, not only do you have a right, you have an obligation to help people to grow. And I think positioning the feedback as a great opportunity, you often find that like at the beginning of people's careers, they get a lot of feedback. But people, as they get more and more senior, they're getting less and less feedback from the people around them. They become complacent. Their self-awareness becomes eroded. They think that they're like a particular version of themselves. Other people see them differently. So lifelong feedback is absolutely crucial to maintaining like an optimal performance. I mean, we should really be encouraging people the whole time to get feedback. And effective leaders, I think, are inviting feedback from the people around them all the time.
Do you think people give leaders honest feedback? And then I guess that was another one of my questions. How do you give feedback to your manager?
I think it's very difficult, and I don't think that leaders get honest feedback. I think they get very ego-stroking feedback, which puts the person in a favorable light with them. So, and I think it is hard to give a leader honest feedback because the stakes are high. You could lose your job, or you could damage the relationship. So it's really difficult. And I don't think there's a large percentage of leaders that can actually accept honest feedback from their staff.
And are even looking for it. I mean, I think it's probably quite rare for people to say, you know, I want to do better as a leader. Can you share some insights, help me grow? I think that's quite uncommon. You know.
And to your point of the source of the feedback, what we see in organizations, specifically with 360s, is if the culture is going through times of a lack of psychological safety, as the messenger of that feedback, you know, people don't, they will just ignore it. Because they'll say, well, the company is out to get me, or they don't believe the feedback. So they'll find reasons to not listen to the feedback.
And I actually agree with that. I mean, it talks to something which Hilton said earlier in how do you prep someone for feedback. I think you have a responsibility as a person who's giving feedback to examine your own motivations and to examine your own emotions before you give that feedback, because you have to have the absolute honest intention of giving that feedback for the right reasons and not some subtle underlying reasons that we sometimes aren't even aware of. You know, somebody annoys you, you're trying to give them feedback, but actually they annoy you. And so, you know, I think you also have a responsibility. That's a kind of an ethical responsibility. Does the person need to hear this? Is this going to benefit them? Are my intentions in the right place? Do I have any hidden motivations or agendas that I might not even be aware of in how I'm giving this feedback? So, and I think people will see past the words to the intention, and that works both ways. So even if you're overly a little bit hard in the way that you've given the feedback, but your intentions are honourable, people will see through that. But at the same time, if you try to give flowery feedback with manipulative intentions, people will also see through that. Maybe not immediately in the moment, but once they've digested it, they will.
And the impact is huge. I mean, people, you know, we can all give examples of feedback that we were given in our careers, and you said that one thing to me and it's still sitting, that one word.
Exactly, that one word that it rings in my head and I can't let go of it, or that one sentence. And I challenge anybody not to have a story of something that someone said somewhere in their lives growing up, usually a childhood thing that stuck with them, and that somehow had a much bigger impact than it actually should have, because the very next person could have heard the same thing and forgot about it a second later.
I think you've touched on something that I wanted to talk a little bit about, which is the unconscious bias around just, are they aware of things like, you know, the recency effect, and how we can also have the halo and the horns going on where we just can only see the best in the person. And I guess that speaks a bit to the motivation, and also keeping in check your own potential bias. And just that spillover from that conflict we had, you know, 2 months ago, and now you're doing my career conversation and you're just going to harp on that.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, I think that stuff really gets in the way, and I think you've got to work hard in the session to say, you know, we know you and I might have had some difficulties before. This is trying to look at your overall. I mean, I think that those pre-conversations, I think, are crucial for kind of laying out the ground rules for how you're going to conduct the feedback session. And I think, I mean, I saw some of the fruits of Lee's labours when I sat in on some of the feedback sessions. And you really can take novice people who are not psychologically trained and teach them the skills of how to conduct yourself in a feedback session. I mean, it's not an opportunity to have an argument. It's not an opportunity to shout at people, to be mean. But it really is just, you know, a great opportunity to share information, to make it interactive, to put ideas forward tentatively, and to really create the right kind of climate in which ideas can be shared. And I mean, I really did see it work, Lee, in a way, in a way that I didn't really expect. I mean, people who I thought would have really found it hard really came in with like an attitude of trying to soften the space and trying to give the stuff over in a good way. So, I mean, I guess this is the thing is that we're saying is that giving feedback is a life skill. You can learn it. You're not most people, I guess, are not naturally born with the skills of how to do it. But you can learn the rules of how to do it more effectively. And I think that's what we saw. And it might be worth looking at some of those, Lee, in the way that you kind of help people to just be more effective in that space.
Well, I think, firstly, thank you so much. It's very encouraging. But I think also what you said is so important, because it is a conversation. It's not about somebody having all the answers and you are bestowing this truth upon another person and they're just there to receive it in a space of gratitude. It really is a conversation, and sometimes if you enter into those conversations, it can open up a whole new understanding between the manager and the staff member that they didn't have before. And maybe that's what you're also seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, even just in terms of the environment, I mean, you could do the feedback across a desk where there's like a bit of a power, I guess, in like an environment where someone's on the side of the desk that has the authority, the other person's on the receiving end. We chose to do our career feedbacks in a coaching room where you're all at the same level, you're in comfy chairs, and like just getting the environment right is part of a message around let's have a dialogue. You know, it's not I'm here to tell you what I think. It's let's share information. And I think that worked really, really well,
So I think from the session that you ran, Lee, I think one of the things that really landed for people was that it's fine, I'm normal, if it's hard to take feedback. Because you just explained that, you know, the idea that it's just a normal part of life, and that we all struggle with it. But maybe you can explain how to, for a leader, how do you package the feedback? And I mean, obviously you can't do the whole workshop now. If people want the workshop, they can contact you. But how does a leader package feedback, not with that traditional psychological sandwich which you hate, and our children also are like, don't give us the psychological sandwich.
So I think for me, so the sandwich, let's just quickly explain the sandwich method, is where you say something positive, then you say a negative thing, which is the feedback you're wanting to convey, and then you end off with a positive thing. But it feels a bit like a formula, and sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect between the positive and the negative, and it's almost as if it's artificially kind of starting with a nice thing, then sneaking in the negative comments, and then ending off with a nice thing again to pacify and wrap it all up in a little bow. So it doesn't feel authentic and genuine and heartfelt. So for me, the most important thing is heartfelt. You cannot give feedback to somebody if you aren't trying to understand them. And one of the ways to give negative feedback is to make it the flip side of the thing that the person does very well, their strength. So if you see the development areas always as the opposite of the strength, then you start with the strength. And I'll just give you some examples. So a very talkative person, you can say, I love how engaged you are, how participative, how enthusiastic you are in our meetings, but sometimes you don't leave enough room for others to voice their opinion. Sometimes you're speaking more than you're listening. So the positive is great, but can you now practice hearing others out, giving them a chance to talk before you then, come in again? And you can do the exact same with the quiet person. You can say, I love how you give others a chance to talk, how you hold back on your opinions, how thoughtful you are, how well you listen, but we miss your voice.
Right.
So that's just two examples of the same thing, but the feedback is given as starting with the positive and then going to the opposite. So it's not the sandwich, because the positive followed then by the feedback are linked.
Yeah. And I mean, does that rule work for every strength? I mean, does everybody's strength have a shadow side in some way, or like most of them, I guess?
I think in your so there would be a difference between what you mentioned earlier, the expert sharing knowledge and upskilling the person. That's a different type of feedback, and that feels more. That's easier, actually. That's a lot easier. It's when it's our behavior, when our psyche that we're commenting on. But it is also true of skills. So, the very analytical person, that's their strength.
Yes.
But they can be too mired in the detail, not always see conceptually, and then vice versa too. So it can actually be some skills as well, but it is mostly about, I would say, behaviors and our psyche, really.
Yes.
Well, we've had in the past times where we've had to give very, very sensitive feedback. So, for example, body odor or some really typical, tricky stuff, which we just avoid doing because it's just so. How do you do that? Do you have
I'll tell you what I once did, which was so hard. I did have somebody that worked for me once who wasn't fresh every single day. That was when I was much younger. I hadn't learned how to do feedback yet. So what I actually did was I put together a little hamper of deodorants and soaps. And I actually gave it to them as a gift, and I said, I hope you'll use this regularly. But I didn't actually say anything. I'm not even sure how one deals with stuff like that. That's really hard, other than you've got to do it with kindness.
Completely.
So you've done a lot of travelling into Africa, and I was wondering, is the way people receive feedback different in the different places that you've worked? Are South Africans more closed or open, or is it just the same?
Actually, that's a good question. I think there is a difference. I think there is a difference. what I see in South Africa sometimes is that people are more defensive, and they actually have been given more feedback, and they tend to be more, there's more of a blasé kind of, I've heard this,
Right.
You're not telling me anything new. Who do you think you are giving me this feedback? Not always, obviously. There are a lot of appreciative people, but I found working in other African countries the exact opposite. I feel people are much more receptive, much more responsive, and much more appreciative of the feedback, because I think they don't get as many opportunities to attend workshops, to their leaders certainly don't give them a lot of feedback. It's more about pure obedience in many of the companies that I've been working with. They certainly don't have opportunities to give feedback, not upwards or even actually downwards. It's considered disrespectful, impolite. So it's actually quite a revelation, because here's somebody giving them feedback that's helpful.
Right.
So I think I find people in Africa more receptive and responsive than perhaps here.
I wonder about it just from a kind of cultural perspective. I mean, if you just think, I know that it's a bit blunt, but if you just look at the individualism and collectivism thing, where like people who are individualistic have got like their ego is very important, that if you threaten people's ego, that makes them feel diminished as a person. But collectivism is much more about fitting in and being part of a group. I mean, have you noticed any cultural differences, say, between giving feedbacks to blacks and whites, and how that differs? Is there anything? Or
well, I don't know if I can say that in the South African context, really. I think it's much of a muchness. In the other African countries, it's mainly black people that we've been working with. But one of the things that struck me actually when I was working in Namibia is how there are several circles of connection. In other words, when you're in a smaller community or a smaller country, your boss at work is also your child, is the best friend of your boss's son. Or, it might be your boss at work, but at church, you're in a more senior elder position. So you then have a higher level of respect in a different context. Or you just don't know whose wife is friends with whose wife, or whose husband is, sitting in the pub after work with somebody else. So it becomes extremely difficult to give honest feedback, because the relationship is not stable in every circle of connection. So it becomes a situation where people actually are too afraid to really ever give feedback, because they don't know who's going to tell who what was said and how they're going. In this context, they might accept it, but in that context, it's taboo. So it's very difficult, actually. So I think that almost doesn't lend itself to a community or an organization that's feedback friendly.
It's not safe.
Yeah.
So Lee, earlier on we were speaking about, be mindful of your intentions and your motivations and your agenda. So are there times when you just shouldn't give the feedback? Like, is there a time when it's just too much feedback? So when you're working with an employee and they're doing it wrong, is there a thing where you're just like, okay, just keep quiet?
Death by feedback.
Yes, exactly.
I do think that. I do. I think, sometimes we latch onto a concept and we think, now we've got to give feedback because this is the new thing and everybody's got to hear the truth. And I do think there's too much of a good thing, and I don't think it's our responsibility to always be telling people. Sometimes people need to figure it out. They need to have a life experience that brings that aha moment. Sometimes they're ready to hear the feedback. Sometimes you can gently test the water, and if you're not finding, the right reaction, let it go until another opportunity arises, or until an incident takes place that you can actually then debrief on it and then weave the feedback into it. So I agree. I don't think we should all be I worked in an organisation with a whole lot of psychologists. We gave each other feedback to death. Eventually,
I know what's that.
Eventually, we all started saying, "Please don't give me any feedback."
Well, that itself
I
was
don't
feedback.
do feedback anymore.
Yeah. And I mean, I can see how in the age of big data, organizations have become obsessed with feedback. I mean, you go to the bank and spend 5 minutes there. When you get back to your emails, there's like rate our interaction with you. You get it all the time, you know. And so I do think in our digital world, organizations are seeking to kind of get feedback the whole time on how they're doing. And, you know, I don't know if they ever respond to it. They don't seem to. But they're certainly collecting the data wildly, yeah.
The concept of balanced feedback, is it possible? Is it just another psychological sandwich idea? How do you know if you're giving balanced feedback?
So if you use the way that I mentioned before, where you look at the person's strength and then look at the flip side, that to me is balanced feedback. So that is really acknowledging the thing that they're good at, but then helping them to see that the flip side of that could be the development area. So for me, that's absolute balanced feedback. What also makes that using that method so powerful and impactful is that it's harder to dismiss the feedback, because you're then also saying, well, then I'm dismissing my strength in the process. And it also works nicely for the person who's too feedback receptive, because they can't just shrug off the compliment, because it is the flip side of the development area. So I think that's really the ideal balanced feedback.
I would add to that is that balanced feedback is some of the stuff that you were talking a little bit about earlier, is about seeing the whole arc of the picture, seeing a big picture, a meta perspective, and not just focusing on something that may have happened last week that was a problem. So if you're giving feedback to a person, you want to take their patterns of behaviors into account and not single out some catastrophic event or something that just irked you. I think balanced feedback is also what you were saying, is to be aware of your own triggers and your own biases, because some things we can amplify as especially problematic, but it might be our stuff. So clearly there's a lot in kind of in giving a balance.
So Lee, how would you prepare someone who is very, very, receptive to feedback? They're very nervous. They've got a career conversation coming up. How could they prepare for that?
Well, I think it goes back to what Hilton was saying, that conversation, that pre-conversation that takes place. And you can even ask them, you know, what will be really hard for you to hear? What are you concerned about? What might have kept you awake last night as you knew we were going to have this talk today? And let's put it on the table. And then you need to be careful around those things, because you know those are then the issues that the person will take very sensitively, overly sensitive about.
At the same time, I mean, as people in a position of a manager or leader in an organization, you have a responsibility to give people hard feedback if it's required. I mean, if you're dealing with someone who is in some way impacting on the reputation of the organization, I mean, you still have to have hard conversations. And I don't think that when we're saying, although there's an art in giving feedback, that you have to be avoidant about the stuff that is difficult. I mean, I think just the opposite. You obviously want to make it land and you want to do things diplomatically, but you have to say what's got to be said. And I think that's a key thing for anything. I mean, it's not about being avoidant, yeah.
Lee, you've worked in organizations for many years. Have you noticed a change in feedback, leaders giving more feedback? Has there been a change at all?
It's hard for me to say, because I think exactly what Hilton said, it's taken, so I don't consider myself an expert in feedback, but it's taken me years to get to this point where at least I feel like things are landing better than they used to. I used to give far too tentative feedback and far too sugar-coated types of feedback, because I didn't want the person to be hurt and I didn't want them not to like me. So I tried to make a connection and then I tried to give them the gentlest of feedback, which often actually meant that the person left the room not really knowing what I was trying to say, because it actually didn't land at all. It was so tentative and so hesitant and so mildly, conveyed to them. So then what happened actually was a candidate that I'd given feedback phoned and said, he didn't really tell me anything that was impactful for me to work on. And I thought I had. So that's when you realize. But that's what I'm also talking about, when you have to examine your own motivation. So that's my stuff that I was then, putting out there for a candidate who genuinely wanted to understand what they needed to work on. And I had failed them in that feedback session. So that was a kind of an aha moment. But then I think sometimes you also perhaps, it's not a perfect science. Then you sometimes feel, well, maybe I said that a little bit too strongly, and maybe that's not the right thing either.
So I think the next question for me is where you are giving feedback to someone who's very resistant and quite arrogant and closed. There's that saying that you should always ask, do you want my feedback? Because often it's very clear by the body language and the attitude that they don't really want your feedback. So how do you work with those people?
So I'm not sure that that's always the right thing to do. I mean, as Hilton was saying, if you're a manager, you are in a way obligated to give your staff feedback when they need that for their own development, or to do their jobs at a competent level, not even to do it better, to improve. So I think it's more about understanding that this person has got extreme protective defense mechanisms. So now you're dealing with an ego that's very vulnerable, and you don't know the backstory. You don't know what has happened with that person that has got them to this place where they've needed to erect these defenses that are like a fortress around them so that they cannot be hurt by feedback. So I think you need to be compassionate. And I know it's hard because it's very frustrating giving feedback to a very resistant person. That's actually interesting, because the feedback sensitive person is usually quite easy to give feedback to, unless you see that they're crumbling before you, then you tend to backtrack. So with the feedback resistant person, if you're compassionate and you understand that these are hard things for them to hear, and that the defense mechanisms are just protective instincts that were there, that helped them to survive whatever the circumstances were that they were experiencing, then you can see it as, this is just very normal. This is just very normal. And I need to show the person that I understand that, but I still have something of value to tell them. So I sometimes give a personal anecdote of some tough feedback that I've heard that felt like a punch in the stomach, but it was actually the feedback that I most value when I look back on it, but it was the hardest to hear in the moment. So if you can personalize it, show your own vulnerabilities that you understand, and if your intentions are honorable, perhaps you can get through to the person, but you can't always. You just have to also accept that you can't.
I mean, I think, when you drill it down, we're all just people, we're humans. You want to have a human encounter in the feedback, one person to another. I have had occasions where I found like someone impenetrable with feedback, and I kind of just exposed it in the session. I said, look, I'm really finding this hard. I mean, I've got information to give you. I think it's valuable. But if this isn't valuable for you, if you think that this is a waste of time, I don't mind if we just call it here, and so I don't want to be sitting there giving information that is where it's an argument and the person is just going to explain everything away. And when I did that, it definitely changed the tone of the session. The person became more, or at least they went through the motions of becoming more receptive. But we often find in 360s, where we're giving feedback at a senior level in a business, it can start out with the person thinking that they've got to explain every little thing that might have a hint of criticism, as the circumstances around it and why it wasn't really a problem. And we really work hard to get past that and just get them to listen, to absorb it and hear the message.
And I think that's what you also said about death by feedback. Sometimes it's about picking out the one thing that you need to land, rather than the 10 things that you think you need to give feedback on.
And I think you also gave valuable advice just in terms of selecting goals, because the tendency is, okay, you're going to select 4 or 5 goals and you're going to work on them, and the next quarter we'll review. And your feedback was it's too many. To really just select the one thing that you can concentrate efforts on for people to change. Lee, what about, we've had this conversation, I've given you the feedback and I did it so well, you didn't get defensive, you weren't oversensitive, and then we meet again and nothing has changed. Then you've got to kind of rehash the conversation. Now it's getting a little bit stale to say, well, this is the strength. And how do you handle it when people are just not changing and there's low performance?
So I think you also have to accept that that's your perspective, that nothing has changed. Sometimes people need to hear a message several times before it actually lands. And sometimes what has landed is an awareness, but there's no behavior change. So I actually often see this when I'm coaching people. I don't know if you see it also. In the room, in the coaching session, I see deeper self-insight, and I see that the fruits of the sessions are taking hold. But yet, when you speak to the manager, nothing's changed. So there's always, to me, a lag between behavior change and the awareness that essentially will lead to behavior change. Or maybe awareness doesn't even lead to behavior change. I mean, there is a theory that the only thing that really changes behavior is to change your behavior. That self-insight can be great, but it doesn't mean anything changes. And you also have to respect that the person might be happy with the way they are. So I had a person who was extremely unassertive. So we were in a coaching relationship where we were trying to build up this assertiveness, and he was practicing things. And then he came back to me and he said, I don't like me when I'm assertive. I don't want to be that person. I want to be kind. I don't mind being pushed around and taken advantage of, because that's me. So he just liked who he was. And why shouldn't he? Just because the manager is saying, you need to help this guy become more assertive, everyone's taking advantage, he's working all hours of the night. He wasn't ready for that. So actually what we did with him in the end was he had a great sense of humor. So we worked on a sense of humor type of assertiveness, where he would respond in a joke. Okay, I think I've got a gap between 1 a.m. and 1:15. Let me get to it then. So we worked on that, and actually that helped him to find a way to be assertive that fitted with him. So I think we have to also understand that we have an agenda. We want this person to be different, but they have their own kind of pace or sense.
I think that's right. I mean, people are complicated. Behavior change is hard. Raising consciousness is often not enough to get people motivated or spurred on to do something about it. And that takes a whole lot of other skills, I think. And probably in a coaching environment where you're meeting people much more regularly, there's an opportunity to build the behavior change through the sessions. I mean, in a once-off feedback session, you're really hoping just to raise consciousness, but the behavior change that follows is much more difficult for the person. I mean, nevertheless, sometimes something magical does happen. I mean, we have seen it where like someone will really respond, really take it on board. But I do think that's rare. Of the things.
And people definitely shift at different paces. And one of the things I think that also been an aha moment for me is that self-insight does not lead to performance success. It's not great self-insight that makes you incredibly successful in life. It makes you, self-insight is very important for personal growth and for maturity, but it doesn't necessarily lead to career growth. In fact, some of the least insightful people are extremely successful. We only have to look at some of the leaders in the world to understand that the insight is missing. And yet they've been very successful in their life. So we also have to understand that we have to understand the place of self-insight. As psychologists, I think we tend to hammer home that self-insight is the golden, the golden standard, but it isn't necessarily so.
I think it can be immobilizing sometimes if there isn't action. And you just, you end up doing all this introspection and self-awareness, and that's where you hear the person say, no, I know that about myself, so what are you going to do about it? Is that comfortable for you to keep being late for every meeting, or keep, at some point you need to see the action and the behavior shift.
I think that's so true. So self-insight, I think, can be immobilizing. It can, because you're saying, well, this is my strength, this is who I am. And now you're telling me, but actually there's a flip side to it. So now how do I be? Because now I can't, how do I display the strength, but in a way that I'm not, the development area isn't so obvious. So it can actually be immobilizing. It can actually be detrimental.
I think one of the groups of people, and perfectionists, I don't know if it's A-type personality or what it is, but they seem to struggle a lot with feedback. If it's a shock to them that they're not actually perfect, and then beat themselves up a lot because they didn't do it well. Is that something that's a common, when you're dealing with senior feedback, that you see that? Or was it specifically with women? I'm not sure, but I get it a lot.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a particular type of person. Other than that, people generally struggle with feedback. Yeah, but I think that is true. People who want to be seen as good enough, and now you're giving them this feedback that actually they're not. It's hard to...
I think locus of control comes into it a little bit. I think you have people... like if you take Donald Trump, he has a full-on external locus of control. If anyone criticizes him, first of all, he struggles to hear it, but he'll always point fingers at the people around him or the environment around him or something around him that was the cause of the problem. And that might be, when you're talking about that kind of personality who just doesn't want to hear it, who thinks that they're wonderful, they just can't absorb it. But he's a real extreme case. I think in business we do find people who have that kind of disposition. They think they're right about everything. They think they need to have all the answers. They've got big egos. They're very difficult to penetrate.
And to please.
But I think that point is so true, because underneath that is the most fragile ego that can't actually admit, maybe I'm not good enough.
Right. Yeah.
I have to have this defense mechanism around me because I can't face the possibility that I'm not as good.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Even build big buildings with gold on them. As a mother of 2 teenagers, how do you give feedback to children? Do you have a magic wand there, or is it different for you when it's your own children?
Yeah, it's totally different because they know I'm a psychologist, so they've learned to manage me. They know Mum's on the warpath, so this is how we behave to get it over with cricket. It just doesn't work when it's your own children.
Yeah.
Or they'll say, don't try your psycho stuff on me.
Yes.
It doesn't work, Mum.
Tell us some tips that we can try on our children.
I wish I knew some.
Yeah, it's bad when your teenagers say, we want a meeting with you, and you know what's coming.
It's worse for them when you want a meeting with them, and then it's like a therapy session.
Yeah.
So, no, I think as parents it's very tricky because we are so much more invested in the outcome, where we feel that we have a responsibility to guide our children, to make sure that they're a success. And, I guess in a work environment, the stakes are less high in some kind of way with your children. You just really want them to hear the message. And, one of the things I've realized as a parent is that the life I've led and the life my children want to lead is completely different. That, they're never going to be clones of me. The things they want to do are different. Their values are different. And often I can just be a witness to how their lives are going and to try to be supportive, but not to really try and change who they are. It's very difficult. Yeah.
Well, it brings in the conversation around millennials in the workplace, because traditionally there was that you respect your leader because it's the position or the authority, it's just given. You're my leader, you're my manager, I give you respect. That's not the case anymore.
No.
And I do think if you're getting feedback from someone who you don't respect, it's not going to land.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
Or whose intentions you don't trust.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely key. Yeah.
Good. Well, I think we can put a full stop there, or a comma. Maybe you'll come back. So thank you, Lee, so much. Thank you, Hilton.
Thank you. It was great.
And I think it's really going to be very helpful content for people to hear.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you.
Giving and receiving feedback is tough for most of us, and Lee explains this is completely normal, and we can train ourselves to become better at both. Compassion and empathy go a long way in providing helpful and heartful feedback. Opening our hearts will also allow us to receive the feedback with less defensiveness. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and comment, and check out our website www.omnicore.co.za for our blog and previous episodes, and a big thank you to William, our producer.